Good morning, and welcome to Strategic Restructuring, Mergers and Creative Alliances. My name is Bob Harrington. I'm a partner with Lafayette Consulting. Our consulting firm specializes in consultation around strategic restructuring, business planning, and organizational change management. I want to introduce my esteemed panelists that are going to be presenting today. To my right is Pat Richards. Pat is the board chair of the Utah Symphony and Utah Opera. She is recently retired from a distinguished career in banking. She is also the vice president of the League of American Orchestras. To her right is Paul Helfrich. Paul is the president and CEO of the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance, which came about very recently as a result of the merger of the Dayton Opera, the Dayton Ballet, and the Dayton Philharmonic Orchestra. He was formerly the president of the Dayton Philharmonic Orchestra. And to his right is Mark Skorka, who is the president and CEO of Opera America, and he's also on the board of the Performing Arts Alliance. And I'll also let them introduce themselves at the time when they are going to be presenting. We have a lot of information to present to you. We'd like you to hold your questions until the end of our presentation. Each of us are going to briefly present to you, and then we'll open it up for questions at that point in time. To start, I want to give you a very, very brief overview of strategic restructuring. This is Restructuring 101. It's going to be very brief. You have the PowerPoint is on the website of the League. You also have several of the handouts as well as a case study that I'm going to be just introducing to you. I encourage you to look at that material more thoroughly to bring you the information that you're going to need if you're going to be exploring any of these options or partnerships. So to start, this first slide shows you the options of restructuring that nonprofits in general are exploring, and I really want to emphasize that these are all viable options for organizations to consider if they are going to be exploring potential collaboration or more in-depth integrative partnership. In the center section, you have two areas, administrative consolidation and joint programming. These are partnerships in which organizations either share back office administrative functions together, either through a contract or some other form of MOU or sharing, or provide services, programs, performing arts programming together. There is no change in corporate structure. Organizations remain totally independent, but through either a contract or MOU, some sort of agreement, you are providing either administrative services collectively to the organizations or consolidating those or providing programming together. When we go to the right section, this is where there is indeed a significant change to corporate structure. A management service organization at the top on the right is a corporation that is created and jointly owned by multiple organizations. It is designed to consolidate administrative functions among multiple parties. For example, let's say you have 3 or 4 organizations. They will create an additional either 501c3 nonprofit corporation or a for-profit corporation, and then consolidate their administrative services into that corporation. So if you have multiple organizations, you need one HR department, one IT department, one financial management department to provide those services for multiple entities. It is jointly owned. In some cases, organizations that get very accomplished at this kind of activity can also then contract out those services to other non-owner independent organizations outside of the ownership group as a funding stream to help support that management service organization. This sounds like a wonderful option for organizations, and it can be, but it can be very, very difficult to manage and structure. It takes a lot of planning and a great deal of investigation in order to put something like this into play. At the bottom of the chart, you have joint venture corporation. That is the same basic structural arrangement as a management service organization, but it's for joint programming purposes. So organizations want to consolidate a certain possible program among multiple organizations. They create an independent, in this case, it must be a 501c3 corporation that is jointly owned, and then consolidating those programmatic functions within that particular corporation. A parent subsidiary corporation is in which two organizations may wish to act as merged and get the benefits of a potential consolidation that can happen through a merger, but for some reason they find they either cannot or do not choose to at that particular point in time to complete a full merger. A parent subsidiary is something that is very easily done by changing bylaws and becoming a membership corporation, and then having just one single member. Something that can be done fairly efficiently. And then you have full corporate merger acquisition. That's the full coming together of organizations, consolidating all of your administrative functions. You can, to the degree you wish, maintain separate identities within a merged organization. And for the types of organizations you represent, that is very critical, to be able to maintain separate identities even though you may be merging those organizations. So that gives you a very brief overview of the options. Organizations are doing this for a whole variety of reasons. Pursuing new opportunities, expanding their capacity, especially around administrative services, greater community impact. Many of these organizations, performing arts organizations, are looking at enhancing their place in their community and bringing in new supporters from their community, and this activity sometimes helps to support that. Accessing new funding. There are many funders who like to see and are urging organizations, especially nonprofit organizations, to consolidate, feeling that they're funding multiple organizations that represent redundancies among those organizations, and sometimes funders are attracted to the consolidation of these organizations. And then increasing efficiencies and reducing costs. You will find that there's not a great deal of cost savings in this activity, but you can increase your efficiency, especially around administrative services, where you consolidate those functions between and among organizations. This is a chart that shows some information coming out of the Collaboration Prize. The Collaboration Prize is a prize that has been given out several times, sponsored by the Lodestar Foundation, and it represents thousands of organizations across the country from all nonprofit sectors. And the reason I want to show you this slide is that it really represents why organizations are considering collaboration and partnerships. And there's an assumption that it is all about administrative savings or consolidation of functions at an administrative level. The reality is the vast majority of organizations that consider this activity are looking to improve their programming, either improving the quality of services, expanding the range and service of their programs, serving more clients, more audiences, improving program outcomes, and of course financial economies of scale. But it really is about the mission of the organization. On the website is a case study that we did around an administrative consolidation that is very interesting. It took place in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the Tennessee Aquarium Under Museum of American Art and Creative Discovery Museum. The case study is pretty detailed in terms of the outcomes of this, but in the highlights is that these organizations decided to consolidate all of their administrative functions. The Tennessee Aquarium, which was very efficient in providing its administrative services, took on the administrative duties for the Hunter Museum of American Art and the Creative Discovery Museum. Over an 8-year period, they saved for the Hunter and the Creative Discovery Museum $3.6 million in an 8-year period. It brought in additional revenue for the Tennessee Aquarium of $1.1 million. They combined their IT functions, their financial management functions, their retail sales, and their marketing. They also did a very successful joint capital campaign because they recognized that they were going to be competing with each other for capital funds in their community and decided to consolidate those efforts. This is a merger that we worked on in 2009, the Oakland East Bay Symphony, the Oakland Symphony Chorus, and the Oakland Youth Orchestra. The most interesting point of this particular one is that these organizations from the outside look completely independent in terms of their identity. They still maintain their separate brands, their separate identities in the community. They consolidated back office, all of their administrative functions, and they're doing increasing programming together. The Oakland East Bay Symphony had a fairly robust administrative services. The Oakland Symphony Chorus and the Oakland Youth Orchestra were very weak in those areas at the time of this occurring. This allowed them to have a greater impact in terms of their administrative services and their back office consolidation. They are increasingly doing programming, joint programming together, sharing artistic direction. Very recently, the Sacramento Philharmonic and the Sacramento Opera merged. In this particular case, it was really to get in front of the community and the funders in a new way. Both of these organizations had gone through a series of significant struggles over the last few years, and they really needed to reinvent their opportunity within the community. They very recently decided to merge these organizations. They've been reaching out to the community. They've been actually quite successful at generating new dollars as a result of the excitement of the opportunity within the community. I think that the test is going to be how sustaining that will be. So far, the experience they have has been quite positive. So what are the keys to success? The first one is mission focus. You really have to maintain the focus on the mission, number one, within any kind of consolidation or partnership. But you also need to be flexible within that mission, pursuing that in terms of growth opportunities. What allows you to grow more effectively through a combination of organizations? What are the new opportunities around programming and serving the community, whether it be performing arts or whether it's in education, the schools and the community? And really having clarity of desired outcomes. What do you want to be when you come through a potential partnership? How do you want to be different? What are some of the metrics that you want to be able to attain through a partnership with another organization? And clearly positive relationships with a potential partner. It all starts with those relationships because it really is about the people that are going to be working within your organization, whether it be the administrative staff, program staff, or board. That positive relation between organizations and the individuals is really key. Some of the roadblocks, clearly autonomy. It is great to be autonomous. Every organization loves to be autonomous, but that may get in the way of your success. Trust. This is a huge trust-building exercise. Organizations need to be able to trust each other and build that trust over time. Self-interest. Everybody has self-interest. It's normal. It's natural. It's part of the process. You need to elevate that into the discussion. And the biggest one is organizational culture. Organizational culture is clearly the most impactful area that can either make or break a potential partnership. What we encourage organizations to do is do an initial self-assessment, looking at your motivations, desired outcomes, having really clear understanding of your critical issues in a financial assessment. Then looking at your partner, what is the level of trust, what are the experiences you've had together, what are the usable assets. If one of the organization has an endowment, is that endowment really available to you in your programming, or is it restricted tightly? What are the compatibility of the mission and the programming? And looking at the financial condition of your potential partner. You can get a great deal of information without even having a conversation with a potential partner, looking at 990s, looking at financial reports, understanding the strength and deficits of a potential program. This is the process we engage organizations in. Basically, it's two organizations creating a joint negotiations committee. That committee is tasked with two tasks, basically, identifying and negotiating all of the issues that the full boards will need to address in making this decision, and the oversight of due diligence, financial and legal ramifications. Once all of those questions have been answered, then the recommendation goes to the full boards for independent decisions. Only a board of directors can make the decision as to whether there's a change in corporate status of that nonprofit. It has to be done by the board. Engagement of the board early on is critical. The other issue for these organizations is the three-legged stool nature of performing arts, involving governance, involving administrative direction, and artistic direction. You can't only work with two of these legs. You really need to incorporate all of these functions within a nonprofit consolidation of performing arts organizations, and that's a little bit different from other types of nonprofits. And then the biggest thing is cultural integration, really working hard to integrate culture of organizations. I was mentioning to Pat earlier, culture eats strategy and tactics for lunch. You can have the greatest strategies and tactics in the world, but if you don't deal with the cultures of the organization, it's not going to be successful. And monitoring that on an ongoing basis is critical. Key success factors: trust, providing for joint decision making, a shared culture, engaging the board early and intensively, good facilitation and process in the exploration and developing a sustainable structure. So now we want to go on to hearing from our panelists. First, we want to hear from Pat, and she's going to talk about the Utah Symphony Utah Opera experience.
Well, thank you, Bob. As we were talking earlier, we've been merged for 11 years now. I'm going to give you 11 years and 10 minutes. So a little bit challenging. We'll be skipping stones across the water here. Actually, this is really timely because we just completed last year a 10-year retrospective study of the merger to look at what worked, what didn't work, and where we needed to go from here. It sounds like a really good strategic thing to do, and it was, but interestingly enough, it was motivated by our need to go back to our orchestra 2 years ago and ask for some concessions to get us through the tail end of the recession. And in the course of that, we really uncovered the lack of trust that the orchestra had in the combined organization, which we thought had been dealt with actually earlier, but kind of came out under the stress of economic challenges. And what we discovered is, and this is not limited to the orchestra musicians, but it really, the information came from them, they simply could not determine whether the challenges that we had faced were due to the external economy or due to the internal structure. And we just couldn't separate the two. So we really had to go into a deep dive on that. Clearly, our merger was financially motivated. That's how it came about. This had been talked about in the community for quite a while, is particularly in the business community and the philanthropic community. Can't we rationalize the structure of the arts in this community? You're always coming to us asking for more money. There must be a better way to run this thing. And a merger had been talked about before. And in particular, the board leadership at that time of at least the symphony side was very experienced with mergers. That's how they had grown and rationalized their own business, and they felt like this was an answer. I think this is unique to us too, but there was also a leadership issue. The opera had been consistently running surpluses and building their endowment. Symphony, somewhat the opposite. And they viewed, and there was a leadership opening on the symphony side, and it was felt that maybe the best thing to do would be to utilize the expertise of the opera to run the combined organization. So it was both financially and leadership motivated. There was also, obviously, we thought we could save costs, and we also thought there would be cross-sell synergies, and we would develop our audiences more deeply. I think we underestimated, as both boards, the cultural differences between the two art forms. Opera and orchestra really run differently in their management structure. Usually, they have different work cycles. The symphony is like every other week or on a regular basis, whereas opera kind of waxes and wanes. And we have 4 productions a year, and we build up to that, and then there's a little respite. But on the other side of the house, it's constantly going on. We thought, again, that we could have some cross-sell synergies and bring opera patrons into the symphony side and vice versa. But what we underestimated is the passion for each art form that those specific audiences have. And there wasn't as much crossover as we thought, and we weren't able to develop as much crossover, even with incentive packages. And I think one of the things that we really underestimated is the difficulty for management, the balancing act of providing the right kind of attention to each art form and making sure that there's internal fairness. One mistake that we made early on, and you alluded to it, is not realizing that brand identity was so important. And our CEO felt that this was such a unique venture in the country at that time. I think we were the largest first early merger. That she wanted to brand them as a combined entity, the Utah Symphony and Opera, and that retrospectively was just a terrible idea. We really needed to go back and separate out the brands and create those identities. As someone said, you don't market GM, you market Cadillac, and whatever else is left. Um, we have had some terrific successes, though, I think, and I think it's important to realize that there are some things that can come positively out of a full merger. We did have cost savings, and we have ongoing cost savings, but they weren't enough to ensure sustainability. As you pointed out, they're real, but they're relatively small in comparison with your overall budget. The community expected this to be the silver bullet. It is not. We have been able to fully integrate some areas, certainly top management, our education departments. We have very extensive education in the state of Utah, and those two departments really, they spoke the same language, and they came together really rapidly and have created a much more robust education program. Finance, that's kind of a no-brainer. It was a good thing to bring the financial back offices together, because one was stronger than the other. Marketing and development are also combined. Artistic, not. I mean, artistic is almost completely separate, except for when we kind of collaborate with ourselves in creating perhaps a semi-staged opera, or when we use our young artists from the opera side to do some of our pops and holiday performances. We do have a larger artistic presence in the community, and I think that has been very beneficial to us overall in fundraising. I think it has actually created, as our CEO likes to say, a larger lifeboat for us during the recession. I think it's highly probable that one of the organizations would have had to totally restructure during the recession to meet the economic realities. We weren't forced to do that. We were able to get by being able to shift resources to where they were needed. I think we have a stronger board, too. The opera board was a 30-member board. The symphony board was a 60-member board. There was no crossover. It's 90 people. We have a 40-member board, which is still big, but we've been able to kind of upgrade it, I think, to a kind of a more robust board. And I think we have an ability to attract talent, because it's an interesting proposition to be able to work on both sides of the industries. One of the real good things that came out of this is that we created a summer music festival, which enabled us to kind of take a more pops approach and into a new market, which is the resort market in the mountains near Salt Lake City. That has been absolutely essential to our survival, and I am totally convinced we could not have done that as a collaboration. We needed to have kind of central management driving that. And it's certainly been more flexible for patrons. They can choose packages. That's something you wouldn't have to do and have a merger to do, but it's been very good. Artistically, I think there have been some advantages. We have much better pit orchestra for the opera because we can control the scheduling. And as I was saying, we don't program Mahler against Wagner and use every musician in town. The principals from the orchestra now play in the opera, and that helps us a lot. We will be doing a semi-staged opera this fall that I think will be very exciting. We started out trying to do what we call enhanced productions, kind of mixing the two. It didn't go over well with audiences because it seemed a little forced. But now I think we have a better idea of how to work together synergistically and create those joint programs. And also, you have no idea how using the costume and prop shop enhances our family and youth programming, particularly the Halloween thing is great. I think from my experience with corporate mergers that culture change takes about 5 years, where integration takes maybe only 2 years. What we found here, I think, is culture change in the arts takes longer than that. You really, I think 10 years in, we still aren't fully integrated as an organization, but we're working hard on it. And just the fact that we did this retrospective laid open some areas that we didn't realize were still festering and enabled us to address them very openly, and that's really helping, because now we have a common language where we know where the hurts are, and we can work together and agreed to work together to try and deal with those. I have to say, I think Bob's slide, the one that really struck me is, I wish we'd talked to him beforehand, the challenges in terms of autonomy of each organization and the branding identity, lack of trust, the self-interest, and the culture were things that we really underestimated. And if we had, as boards, had the opportunity to talk about those things more as opposed to focusing on the financial and structural, I think we might have still made the same decision. I think probably would have, but I think we could have done a better job initially of implementation. Overall, I would say I have to think this has been successful. It I think works pretty well. It's hard to run. It's a big challenge for management and for the boards to understand the needs of all of these artistic forms and to balance resource allocations and the attention. So I think it takes more work, but it is, for us, I think in our community, has been worthwhile.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. The Dayton experience is a lot more recent. As Bob mentioned, it is relatively young. We're coming up on our first year anniversary. Our merger effective date was July 1st, 2012, and that was the day the merger of the Dayton Ballet, Dayton Opera, and Dayton Philharmonic became official as a single 501c3 organization, the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance, the first merged ballet company, opera company, and symphony orchestra in the United States. I want to give you a little background about each of the three merger partners. Dayton Ballet is actually the second oldest ballet company in the United States. Only the San Francisco Ballet has been in continuous operation for a longer period of time. We have 19 professional dancers in the company, a ballet school with 2 campuses, and a training company, and the ballet mounts 4 productions a year. Prior to the merger, none of them with live music, all of them with recordings. The Dayton Opera is 52 years old. It does 4 productions a year, typically 1 star gala and 3 fully staged productions. The orchestra was performing as the pit orchestra for Dayton Opera. And Dayton Philharmonic does 76 performances of approximately 35 different programs every year. Philharmonic brought to the table an education program that reached nearly 50,000 students in 13 Ohio counties. So you had 3 organizations that each had their own proud history, traditions. What brought us to the table? Well, probably no surprise to anyone in this room, it was economic challenges, particularly in the aftermath of the 08-09 economic downturn. Each of us kind of had to take some time and think about what the future might hold. The economic base that had built these organizations and that allowed them to thrive in Dayton had changed because the local economy was rooted in heavy manufacturing industries that are now, by and large, completely gone. And this is a familiar story all throughout the industrial Midwest, and it impacts participation at all levels, including donations and ticket sales. And then you layer the recession on top of that, with drops in foundation, corporate, and governmental funding, losses in endowment values, and it was a come-to-Jesus moment for all of us, without question. So in order to weather the storm, we all did what we need to do. There were bridge funding campaigns launched. We embarked on a business model review group at the Philharmonic. We started some new series, launched some new initiatives, but make no mistake about it, we also cut programs, we cut salaries, and we cut staff. And the opera went through a similar process, going from 3 performances of each of their productions over 2 weekends down to 2 over 1 weekend. The ballet staff was reduced to a real skeleton crew of about 2 people trying to do virtually everything with some volunteer support. And, one thing that I believe very strongly is you may be able to cut your way to a balanced budget for a year or 2, but you cannot cut your way to long-term success. And I think each of the 3 partners were looking at that and saying, all right, we may have achieved some level of stability, but what's the future hold? 5 years down the road, where are we going to be? So all of us were looking for a real game changer. And when we first came to the table, we fairly early on identified some really key reasons why it made sense for us to explore a merger. First of all, we were all producers of performing arts with artists resident in the community. We were not importing shows from outside, and that was a key distinction between us and the other very large arts organization in our town is the Victoria Theater Association, which is the Broadway presenter and also the landlord for all three organizations, both for the performance space and administrative space. So we said, well, their business is very different than ours, but ours are all somewhat similar in our focus on artists that are here and on producing rather than presenting programs that are unique to Dayton. Of course, all three were rooted in traditional performing arts, and the centrality of symphony orchestra music was also something that emerged. Even though the ballet was not using a live orchestra, we immediately saw what a wonderful enhancement that would be for the very excellent company to have a live orchestra supporting it, and what a potential gain for the orchestra that would be to add ballet services to our schedule, certainly in that it would give us greater flexibility maybe to shed some services on the Philharmonic side that we really felt could be used in a more revenue generating or a more effective way. And finally, and this really is key, we did all three have a track record of successful collaboration, and there was a good level of trust already among the key players. Now, it was certainly not enough to get this done quickly. This was a 2-year process, and frankly, that was about as fast as I can imagine it happening. But you have to have that level of trust to begin with, and then you must build on that throughout the process. So while economic challenges got our discussion started, we quickly did realize that what was really intriguing about this was the potential artistic opportunity the merger might present, a chance to collaborate in new ways, planning our seasons side by side that had not been possible before. And certainly when you're separate organizations, you can collaborate, but it makes a big difference when you are basically all on the same team, as it were. We did see funding opportunities from local sources and some regional and national ones that would not have been interested in us in our old models doing business in our traditional ways. We made a decision early on that in the merger we would retain separate artistic leadership for each of the three art forms. And we saw that not only as a practical necessity, but also a way to help each art form continue to have a champion and a touchstone in the community where they would still have the ballet director and the Philharmonic director to identify with in terms of championing that particular art form. So this process began in the summer of 2010. We went through an early phase of a merger study that was basically about considering, do we want to go with a shared services model, just integrate the back office functions, or do we want to explore more complete forms of integration? And that fits very well with the slide Bob had where you saw, the one end where it's strictly a collaborative partnership with greater autonomy, and then we did opt to go all the way to the other side of that scale with the full Monty, if you will. But I think that was a classic case of the highest risk being associated with the highest potential reward. So we put together a steering committee that was made up of board, artistic, and executive leadership from the three organizations that worked all through calendar year 2011 with the assistance of Strategic Leadership Associates, our consultant, to formulate a comprehensive merger plan. And this included 5-year financial projections. It included a fundraising overview and cross-referencing of the donors to identify where there was crossover and duplication. We conducted stakeholder forums for our employees, for our major donors, for our volunteer associations, and for our corporate members. Bob mentioned that the decision to merge must be made by the board. Well, in our case, not only did the board have to vote and make a recommendation, but all three organizations were membership corporations. So we had to actually put the final decision up to a vote of the members. Actually, it was the ballet and the opera had to do that. In the case of the Philharmonic, even though there were members, the board was empowered to make the decision. But certainly there was another layer of complexity and other constituents who had to be in the loop. We were successful in attracting some funding commitments, both from our local community foundation and from an anonymous national foundation, should the merger go forward. So the board saw that potential for additional funding was there, and it was real. So with positive votes to proceed in early 2012, the real fun began, because that's when we turned to the legal due diligence and to the selection of the new board. Between the three organizations, we had 107 board members, and the new code of regulations called for a board of 36. But that was actually a fairly, under the circumstances, as much of a painless process as I can imagine. I think the nominating committee that was assembled, 6 people, 2 from each of the 3 organizations, went about it the right way by first identifying what a new board member would look like, what the expectations would be. And they were enhanced not only in terms of financial support, but also in terms of the time commitment, because we knew that this was going to be a new and delicate creature that was about to hatch, and that it was going to take a lot of attention and nurturing on the part of the board, and a focus that perhaps had not been the norm in the past. So with that well-articulated set of expectations, a number of board members self-selected out of the process. So that helped winnow the list. And our goal all along had been to not only retain some board members from the predecessor boards, but also use this as an opportunity to recruit new board members, bring some new people on board who would be intrigued by this possibilities of this innovative merger. And we were able to do that, get the new board in place. And as I mentioned, as of July 1st, 2012, with all legal due diligence completed and all appropriate paperwork filed with the state, the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance became a reality. So I want to mention a number of factors that I think helped make this work. First of all, our artistic directors did set the tone for all of us. Their focus was always on the art. They were able to put ego aside and focus on what was going to be best for the organizations. And that attitude proved contagious. That spread to the board members involved, just as the opposite attitude would also have been contagious. If the people had been trying to protect their turf, had been suspicious, if there had been a lack of trust, I don't think we would have gotten very far at all. I think another factor that helped us was because we all had reduced staff significantly over the years preceding the merger. This was not something that was going to be about mass layoffs. In fact, a lot of the savings that were realized from ending some outsourcing arrangements and so forth were reinvested in just the opposite, in ramping up staff, in putting together some capacity that had not been in place, even with the more deeply staffed organization, which was the Philharmonic. Between the three organizations, between expense cuts and vacancies, there was only one development director among the three organizations prior to the merger. So we were able in that area to put together a stronger team and bring in an outstanding development professional. And in a reversal of how this usually happens, we were actually able to hire someone away from a hospital to come in and work on development for the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance. I think another thing we did well was we kept all our constituents, including our artists, well informed throughout the process. As soon as this reached the board level, we had an independent PR firm in town handle a media announcement and media relations. We didn't want that to come from any of the three organizations because we did not want it to look like one of them was kind of driving the bus. We wanted it to be what it was, which was a discussion among three equals at the table. And we wanted the community to know that we were looking at this because all three of us were going to leave no stone unturned in investigating various possibilities to keep the arts alive and strong. And our message was, this is something we are looking at. We welcome your input. Let us know what you think. We will keep you informed, but we want to be very clear that this is something we are talking about and looking at very seriously. So I want to end with just a couple observations that I have from just the one-year perspective, which, to take it for what it's worth, it certainly doesn't have the maturity of a 10-year outlook. But I think it's okay to go into discussions like this with finances as a factor. That's reality, but they can't be the only factor. There need to be strong artistic or mission-related interests as well as you consider the process. Another thing is you need to consider this with a long view. In deciding whether this is right for your organization, you really can't compare it to the status quo unless you feel very confident that the status quo can be maintained indefinitely. If you're concerned about what your current financials, what your current subscription numbers, whatever the indices are, if you're concerned about what they may look like in 5 years, then you have to think about, well, what's going to best position you for success. A merger doesn't guarantee anything, but in Dayton, our feeling was that the merger best positioned us for future success, whether it's in ticket sales, artistic growth, or in fundraising. I would also say be prepared to take a long time. This should be a long courtship and not a shotgun marriage. It's something that you should look at very thoroughly and make sure that questions are answered. At the same time, you should work with an experienced facilitator, someone who's been down the road before, so that you don't hang up unnecessarily on issues that can be thorny. And finally, last point I want to make is once again to reinforce, be open about the process, not necessarily after the first meeting, but as soon as this is a real thing, something that the boards are aware of, you need to be upfront and take that to the public. Thank you.
Let's go to Marcus Lopez.
Thank you so much, Robert. I want to just thank the League for inviting someone from the opera field to come to your conference. It's a pleasure to be here and to see that our conference looks a lot like your conference. I'm a real believer in partnerships. I was the chairman of the 2004 Performing Arts Convention. I was the co-chairman with Ann Meyer Baker of the 2008 Performing Arts Convention, so I have earned collaborative stripes. That said, I'm a merger skeptic, and I wanted to bring to the panel some of the skepticism I have from a purely theoretical point of view, because I haven't experienced it in an organization as Pat and Paul have. I also want to commend Pat in being such an extraordinary board member, both of the League and of her own cultural organization. As a matter of fact, Opera America honored Pat at our winter board meeting for being such an outstanding trustee for the performing arts. So congratulations again, Pat. I wanted to take a moment just to ask a couple of questions of those in the room. How many people represent merged organizations here in the room? A few. How many are here because your organization is seriously thinking about merger? How many are here because you are just curious about it? Okay, so that's the largest population. In those who are seriously talking about it or have done it, has it been motivated more by exhaustion or excitement? Exhaustion or excitement. For those who have been in it, who are seriously considering merger or are merged, is it the outgrowth of excitement? Is it the outgrowth of exhaustion? One honest person in the room. Thank you. Because I'm at the other end of the phone when people are calling, when the opera company calls and they're talking about merger, and inevitably, or I get calls from board members. Inevitably, the calls that I get are outgrowths of exhaustion and not excitement, where people are simply financially spent. The rock has been pushed up the hill as many times as they possibly can push it up the hill, and 2008-9 made the hill steeper. And people who were already tired from pushing the rock up the hill were looking at a longer, steeper hill. And that a lot of the calls to me were more of the shotgun nature. We need to do something different fast, and we're exhausted. And I guess some of my skepticism is rooted in that as an awful motivation to think about changing the nature of your performing arts institution. But that is the preponderance of the inquiries that I get. So I guess, point one for me is to be reflective about the motivation and honest in terms of where it is rooted. I'm taking a look, and I annotated in the PowerPoint presentation, Robert's page 3, where he talked about why do nonprofits consider strategic restructuring. And the first one is pursue new opportunities. And what was so interesting to me that even here in Pat's presentation and in Paul's, Pat stated that merger was financially motivated. and Paul that there are economic challenges were the first points in their presentations. So that pursuing new opportunities was not what was at the top of the deck. And in fact, on page 3 of the PowerPoint, the increase efficiency and reduce costs was the last bullet point, whereas what we've heard in reality, it was the first bullet point. Building capacity, yes, but we all know that building capacity requires new resources. And generally, we are dealing with financially exigent organizations where new resources to invest in capacity building isn't necessarily an option, but where, in fact, resources have to be optimized in order to keep the organizations alive. The fourth bullet on page 3 is greater access to funding. And this is one of the items, again, where my skeptic antenna goes up in two ways. One, and we did hear from Pat that funding community was looking for a rationalized system, and I certainly know from my long-term friendships with people in the funding community that funders become, especially long-serving funders, become really frustrated over time when they are once again being asked for a big grant to erase debt and establish a cash reserve and finally stabilize the organization. And 5 or 10 years later, a new staff member at the symphony or opera company is asking for a similar grant. That progress is incremental, even though the funding need seems only to increase. So a rationalized system, wishing for something different, always grows out of that. Board members who extend their corporate experience to the arts. And I believe that I have a presentation I do about the 21 reasons boards make bad decisions. And one of them is dismissive oversimplification, that board members assume because we're dealing with a $5 or $10 or $15 million entity that it must be infinitely simpler than my bank or manufacturing corporation, when in fact they're more complicated because of the various unions and egos and the dynamics of volunteer philanthropic organizations. And just because it works in the corporate world where there's the potential for redundancy and improved stock price, and well, if it doesn't work, we can just spin it off, that dismissive oversimplification when applied to the arts can certainly be fatal. But within that structure, the notion that if someone is a donor both to the symphony and to the opera, that they will double their gift to the merged entity is one that just doesn't hold true. So I am skeptical because of the potential for diminished philanthropy as opposed to increased philanthropy as Acme Industries, I'm making up the name of that, decides, aha, I don't have to give 2 $25,000 gifts, I can just give 1 $25,000 gift to this merged entity. Similarly, the funders who get really excited, and I've been president of Opera America for 23 years, and so I know about funders who get excited about one thing only to be cold about it tomorrow. The funders who get excited about this new approach to arts infrastructure might support it for 3, maybe 5 years, but will they be there for the long run? Because in fact, sometimes this merged effort requires more investment of staff time and resources. So and again, this is not to say no. I think this should be thought about in many communities. But I just want to be the cold skeptic, if you will, to say, think carefully. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Where is among your organizations redundancy? If you merge 2 weak organizations, you don't automatically get a strong organization. And given how under-resourced most of our arts organizations are, if you bring 2 of them together, do you actually have overlapping staff that can be eliminated? Do you, in bringing them together, actually eliminate work that could lead to the elimination of staff? Or is it the same amount of work because it's still an opera company and still a symphony orchestra? Is it in fact more work because of the desire for collaborative programming or creative promotions and marketing and fundraising? So again, this is in the realm of those skeptical questions. Again, the factors on page 4 of the slide deck, factors that best describe why this collaboration was formed. Again, this from the Lodestar Foundation. Number 1 here is improved quality of service programs. And what we have heard, of course, is that it is financial pressure that has in many ways led to the merger. I found it really interesting. Robert, I love language. and the notion that in Sacramento this was to get in front of funders in a new way, the merger. Two organizations, well, I can speak for the operating company, going bankrupt. It wasn't about, in a way, getting in front of funders in a new way. It was about avoiding complete bankruptcy on the part of the opera. I can't speak to the symphony. So again, being honest in how we talk about it and making sure that we are not looking at that shotgun marriage as Paul represents. I sometimes wonder, what is the impetus? We've talked about that. Who advocates for the merger? From a lot of what I hear sometimes, the merger is advocated for by a third party, a major foundation in town that is tired of the annual pleas for major grants to get rid of debt. Is the impetus internally driven out of excitement or externally driven over what may be resistance or resentment? Because it will shape absolutely the nature of the discussions. So thinking carefully, is it about exhausted board members, or is it about an inspired vision of what we can look for? What does happen to the staff? Because in certain situations, it is clear that you don't need 2 finance directors or 2 executive directors. And in the corporate world, with parachutes that are available and people having accumulated stock options, it's one thing to eliminate redundancy. But in the nonprofit world where we don't have those systems, there are people at stake. And what's going to happen to those people? Same at the board level. And I find it really interesting to hear of Paul's experience with the merged boards there, because I believe smaller boards are better, and you've got one stronger board as a result of bringing this together. But not only what happens to the boards, what happens to the passion. Because what we do find is that major donors generally identify with a favorite art form. And we don't want to deprive those major donors of either the local patriotism. There was an orchestra I'm thinking of that became a merged state orchestra, and it failed. Because as a state orchestra, people didn't feel the local patriotism that they felt when it was an orchestra named after their city. So when you bring entities together and start playing with names, do people lose their enthusiasm for their local group or for their own art form around which they have a particular passion, but that passion may be diluted in the larger entity? Serving on the board is more about the larger corporate entity than it is about the art form. So these are just things that I put on my list to consider. Again, keeping in mind the external resources that may be there to help out at the outset, will they be there for the long haul? And that problem of dismissive oversimplification when it comes to board members who have the experience from the corporate world, where indeed the profit motive may provide a much simpler framework within which to think about merger. I'm a huge believer in collaboration, and I'm not surprised to hear Pat talk about the educational enhancements of bringing together wonderful education programs that can play off the art forms in a very positive way. So, as someone who's a real advocate for partnership and collaboration, I support exploring this. I just want to do it with real, with the blinders off, so that way as you go into it, we're not stumbling over some of the feel-good language that is the result of the hard labor of these leaders in the field. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Let's open it up for questions, and I've been asked to repeat the questions so we can get these on tape. So, yes, sir.
That did happen. The question was, do donors actually reduce their contributions when you combine organizations? We did find that some did. I mean, it wasn't from 20,000 or from 40,000 to 20, but it was typically, if I gave 10,000 here and 10,000 there, I gave 15 to the combined entity. We did have some of that. On the other hand, we did have some foundations that stepped up and gave us extra because, for sure, maintained their current level of giving to both organizations, and even apportioned it specifically so that they showed their commitment to each one.
And Pat, has that lasted over time where those foundations really sort of stepped up to the plate to help?
The ones that were able to continue
The
to do
confusing
so.
factor of 2008.
Yeah, again, the market values in the economy reduced all their giving.
Yes.
The question was in the Dayton merger discussions, was one organization significantly larger than the other two? And yes, that was the case. The Philharmonic was certainly larger in terms of budget and staff than the opera or the ballet. And if you're in that situation, this is where this becomes a very, something that has to be approached with great sensitivity. And we knew from the Philharmonic standpoint that if we went into this as a 600-pound gorilla, we probably wouldn't have lasted 2 weeks in terms of discussions. So our goal was to always approach it as discussions between 3 equals. Now that does bring up one of the things that's challenging about this on a tactical level, which is we are strategically 3 equals, and opera, ballet, and symphony orchestra concerts are of equal importance to our mission. But as Pat pointed out, on a day-to-day basis, the Philharmonic is more visible because we're literally playing just about every weekend. So that's one of the real challenges for messaging, is to convey that sense of the equal nature of the art forms on an ongoing basis, even though in a given month the vast majority of activity may be from the film.
I just want to add to that, and I so agree with what Paul said. It's interesting in Pat's case that the opera company is actually the stronger organization 10 years ago, although the smaller one. So many times the calls that come to me are that the symphony wants to take us over. And in most cities, the opera company is smaller. And whether it is a reasonable process to go through exploring a merger, when it is the smaller organization in the situation they just feel take over, whether or not that's the attitude that's driving it. It is the imbalance that leads to that human response of takeover. And if this is to succeed, probably the larger organization, whichever it is, or the stronger one, whichever it is, needs to bend over backwards not to make it feel like a takeover.
The question was, did donors in designating funds to one or the other organizations create an underfunding situation from one of them? Truthfully, we actually strived in our development activities to get unrestricted donations. And for the most part, largely we have. So that I can't really say that that was an unintended consequence. We have some designated giving, but a lot of it is undesignated, and that gave us flexibility during the downturn. The question was, have we improved the board in the sense that they are more active and more engaged and more visible and fundraising activities in the community and personal giving? This is one of these multiple variable equations that it's really hard to say, because I think in our community Dayton probably has the same experience. Over that same period and starting just before this, we've started to lose a lot of corporate headquarters. And so, in general, in the community, all of our nonprofits find that it's a little harder to recruit the high visibility boards because a lot of corporate executives aren't there anymore. They report to somewhere else. And the new emerging entrepreneurial industries have a different culture and don't get involved in board service as much. This is like a completely different from merger situation. However, for us, I think specifically one of the interesting situations is our opera board was very engaged in fundraising, and that was because of the CEO's leadership. The symphony board was more of a letterhead board and wasn't engaged. And so for those, I mean, we really, when we put the two boards together, we tried to get equal numbers from each side to create that balance. And the symphony board, formerly symphony board members that came on board, the new board, were totally unprepared for the expectations of fundraising. As we have turned over the board over 10 years, that has been made very explicit, and our board is more engaged than it was in the past in fundraising. And I think we have not quite as much high-level visibility in the community, but I think that's not necessarily because of the board. It's more a result of the different corporate structure and business structure in the community. But we're striving actually to attract those newer leaders onto the board. Question is, how did artistic leadership and musicians feel about the merger, and how were they involved in the process? One of the reasons I think both boards were really encouraged to give this merger a try was because the artistic director or the music director of the symphony and the general director of the opera, who was also the artistic director in that culture, were very much in favor of it and became the drivers of it and saw a great deal of artistic opportunity in it. And I think I think most boards would say, if you're going to go into merger, boy, you want leadership to be in front of you, not dragging their heels. And so that was very encouraging. On the other hand, the musicians felt alienated by this. They felt they weren't consulted. And that created some animosities right up front that we have been dealing with ever since. I think we have tried many ways to try and involve them more, and I think we're being more and more successful as we go along. But that is not to be underestimated. And I will say the staff, too. The staff didn't feel like they had input. Those things should have been addressed better up front.
Yeah, I will. Our experience was similar. As I noted, what set up the initial round of meetings, like maybe the first 3 or 4, was the sense of fiscal challenge. But what kept this thing going, what really gave it legs, was the enthusiasm of our artistic directors. Neil Gittleman, the conductor of the Philharmonic, has been a champion of this process right from the start, and Tom Bankston and Karen Russo-Burke, his counterparts of the opera and ballet, are right there with him. And that is absolutely key, because it became a process about enhanced capacity, enhanced opportunity, and greater potential, and that provides a very positive reason to move forward. The musician involvement was there right from the beginning. The first time this idea ever surfaced was in a business model review group that had representation from the orchestra. One of the early things we did as we worked through 2011 in the merger study was put together an artistic visioning committee, and all the art forms were represented by artists on that committee, as well as by board members and staff, looking at things like how a merge schedule might work. So I think the musicians were kept informed. I think they adopted kind of a wait and watch and see attitude. They were neither for nor against it. I think their attitude after 1 year is positive. Certainly, with 83 musicians, you're not going to have a firm consensus on just about anything. But there are some that are concerned about additional pit work. On the one hand, the additional work is nice, but is our identity, our profile as high as it is when we play on stage? But I think the overall feeling now after a year has been, well, this is working out well for us. And as I said, we tried to keep them in the loop as much as we could throughout the process.
Okay, I'm going to have to try and keep all these straight. First of all, what do you do with the orchestra, the rest of the orchestra, when the opera is performing and you have a smaller orchestra in the pit? We try to program like educational opportunities and things like that against that. So we try and find ways to utilize the remainder of the musicians. I'm the board chair. I'm not as technical in that. They try to fix it. The other one was how, let's say you have a large endowment and a small endowment, how do you merge those? We did keep those designated as separate, restricted, if they were restricted, and in fact we considered the opera endowment as it came in, the part that was restricted to be restricted to opera. There was an unrestricted portion which became part of our unrestricted endowment. The entire symphony endowment that came in was restricted because they had spent their unrestricted endowment. So that we just have designated that in that way. And I'm sorry, I've lost track of the third question. Yes, it has been talked about, but we have rejected that as not feasible at this point in our community. There's a couple of reasons. One of it is, honestly, we're a 2-ring circus, and that's hard enough to manage. A 3-ring circus would be really challenging. And the other thing that I think is really important is we never played for the ballet. They have a separate pit orchestra. That's a really divisive discussion when you get to it. And in fact, as we say, almost everybody in the ballet pit is married to somebody in the symphony, and we don't want to be responsible. I don't have, the question, as I understand it, is would there be a difference, or could we speak to the idea of merging 2 symphonic institutions as opposed to 2 organizations from different cultures like symphony and ballet or symphony and opera? I don't have that experience. I will say that I would very much be interested at some point in the opportunity to integrate a youth orchestra into our overall umbrella, because I think that would be very synergistic. I think it would have a lot of, there are cultural dissimilarities, but there's this kind of feeder atmosphere to it that I think would work well together. But we haven't explored that other than just very informal inquiries from a couple of youth orchestras. And I'm not sure under what circumstances we would do that. So I don't really have the personal experience to be able to address that. It seems to me it would be easier to integrate two orchestras than two dissimilar things.
Well, Pat touched on in her earlier question what the real issue would be there is if you were going to take two orchestras with two separate groups of musicians and combine them as one. One of the things that is certainly a bright line for the union is a situation where some players are going to gain at the expense of others. In other words, making it a zero-sum game. So I think that would be something we don't have experience with because, as I mentioned earlier, our orchestra was the opera orchestra and there was no ballet orchestra. So that was something in our favor that kind of eased the way for the Dayton merger. If there had been a freelance orchestra playing for the ballet, then I think this would have been a considerably more challenging proposition.
Let me restate that. I maybe misunderstood the question. I was thinking more of an umbrella organization that might have provide a cover for orchestras in different locations. I think actually trying to merge two orchestras would be as difficult as Paul pointed out.
I'll go first on this one. In our case, the answer is a definite yes. We would have done it all over again because there is a sense of optimism and a sense of possibilities now after 1 year of merged existence that had not been present before. Now, Mark makes a very good point about, part of the reason for that is we were able to tap some funding opportunities that are finite and that are not going to go on forever. But I think, as I said earlier, at the end of the day, this is about what best positions you for future success. Now, you might look at this in another community, talk about it, study it, and say, we think we're better off staying separate. But in Dayton, what we found was that this best positions us for future success. We don't have guarantees that there's going to be funding from some of the special sources, but we really don't have guarantees that there's going to be funding from any source. And we think this new combination and the greater capacity it provides puts us in a stronger position to fundraise and sell tickets and drive those revenue streams that make the arts possible.
It's really hard to say what ifs, but I think that if the opportunity were presented to us today, I think we would do a better job of analyzing it and doing it right, and I think our possibilities would be better, as Paul pointed out. Frankly, our timing was really bad, and if you go back and look at the last 10 years and how difficult they have been in many ways, if I had known they were going to be that difficult, I would have gotten exhausted and gone away. But I think we did the right thing, and I think if we did it again, we'd do it even better.
I want to thank our panelists and see if there's any last comments. I really appreciate all of the comments. One of the things that we talk about organizations moving into this exploration is you need healthy skepticism. You need people asking the hard questions at the table to make sure that you are exploring this as fully and in depth as possible. And so I really appreciate all of the comments that individuals have made.